I'm very happy to welcome to Forward Guidance Dr. Perry Mehrling, Professor of International Political Economy at Boston University's Frederick Pardee School of Global Studies. Professor, welcome to Forward Guidance. I'm so glad that you could make it. How are you doing?
I'm great, and thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm so glad you're here, Professor. You are the author of Money and Empire, Charles Kindleberger, and the Dollar System. There we go. We're matching. Professor, just to start off, tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write this book.
I was actually trying to understand international finance. I was trying to extend the money view tradition to international money. And so I initially was trying to write a biography of the global dollar. And then I found Kindleberger, and he was a perfect kind of foil for this story. But I wanted to learn about how international money works.
As we start, Professor, I would say, what is the global dollar system? What are its key features?
So the important thing to understand is that international money is the dollar, pretty much exclusively, and all other currencies are sort of tied into the dollar through a set of FX swaps and international lender of last resort. We can get into that as much detail as you want. It's a hierarchical system in that regard. It seems that the hierarchical character of it pleases no one. Okay, that the people who are not in dollar countries are unhappy about dollar hegemony, as they call it, and the U.S. is not happy that it has responsibility for the global dollar system. So it arose. I suppose it's important to appreciate that it seems to have arisen organically. It was not created by a treaty or anything like that. And this hierarchical character is also organic, and it grows through crisis. Maybe that's another thing to mention. So we're currently in a period of tightening, and so U.S. monetary policy is global monetary policy, for better or for worse, and that's putting strains on the system, and we're finding out where it's going to break, and that's the time we're living in right now, after a period of a decade of incredible ease. My previous book, the new Lombard Street, treated the dollar system. It was really very domestic, and it was really about the Fed. And so I realized as soon as I finished it, it ends with the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9. That was what inspired the publisher to ask me to write it. And I realized, so you were asking where this book came from in the first place. One reason was I was disappointed by the 2011 book. I realized, this was a global financial crisis. This wasn't so this is the wrong frame. We need to understand international money. We need to understand the international role of money in order to understand this. And it's taken me 10 years or really 12, I suppose, since to get there. I'm glad it's out.
Me too. So I guess what you're talking about is the so-called Euro-dollar system of dollar balances and dollar liabilities that are offshore. And that's not talking about the euro currency relative to the dollar, but just the euro money, euro dollar system.
Yes, that's very important. I should have said that. I mean, you caught the idea that the dollar system is largely an offshore system. Okay, and it's not just an offshore system; it's largely a private dollar system. That the liabilities, the dollar liabilities that are clearing international transactions, are the liabilities of global banks. Okay, not the liabilities of the U.S. central bank. And so it's a private system. It is an offshore system. So it's not really, a government thing. It's a business thing.
Right. And I got a question I always wanted to ask. So many viewers, listeners will be aware that the dollar is this standard currency for invoicing trade. If they want to buy oil or copper, most of the time folks buy it in dollars, regardless of where they are around the world, and they can accumulate reserves, foreign exchange reserves, mostly U.S. Treasuries denominated in reserves. But when it comes to the Eurodollar system, is it true that foreign banks can sort of create dollar assets and dollar liabilities in the same way that U.S. domestic banks can, sort of creating money?
Yes. What I call in my class is the alchemy of banking, expanding the balance sheet on both sides. Yes, that's correct. There is a difference in the sense that the foreign banks don't have direct access to the Fed, so they have to worry about, well, what if somebody wants to move that deposit to some other bank or withdraw it or something? So the offshore dollar system has developed mechanisms for that, and it also has mechanisms for tying into the onshore dollar system too, in times of stress. So that's why it took so long, to develop all of these institutional structures. You don't know what institutional structures you're going to need until you start building, and then it breaks here, and you say, "Oh, I guess that really wasn't as stable as I thought it was," and you fix that thing, and then the next time it breaks somewhere else. And so that, yes, that's right. That it is in fact a banking system. So it has that feature. I always say in my classes, the essential. All banking is a swap of IOUs. And so you put your finger exactly on it, that yes, there is that elasticity of being able to create money by expanding the balance sheet on both sides. But there's then discipline, because the question is whether the world wants to hold those dollar balances or in liquid form, okay, or do they want to hold them in treasuries? Do they want to hold them in mortgage-backed securities? What do they want to hold them in? And so you keep moving back and forth, elasticity and disciplining by the holders of money. In what form would they like to hold their dollar wealth?
Thanks for that, Professor. So there are many evident strengths of the Eurodollar system, which I'm sure we'll get into. But let's just start with the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities, not weaknesses, of that system, and why might it require a lender of last resort to sort of make sure that there isn't a crisis?
Well, that's just the feature of all banking systems. It has nothing particularly to do with the fact that it's global. That's true domestically, as well. I come from a tradition of monetary thought, where we speak of the inherent instability of credit. This is from Ralph Hawtrey. Once things come unglued and people want to, there's a flight to liquidity, to dollars. That's when the lender of last resort can prevent the system from unraveling, because it can create the means of payment, and so it can satisfy that need, in a time of crisis. That's true of all banking systems, and as I say, the offshore, the Eurodollar system is a banking system. So that the difficulty of providing lender of last resort is really largely political. Okay, because the monetary system is global, but political system is national. Okay, and so whether the Fed can be the international lender of last resort is kind of in question. Is the U.S. willing to let it do that? Okay, is really the problem. And if not, then no one else really can do that. So then you don't have an international lender of last resort, and so the crisis will play out. In fact, you could compare what happened in the global financial crisis with what happened in the COVID crisis of March 2020. Many of your listeners will say, what COVID crisis? Well, why? It's because the Fed quite immediately stepped in as international lender of last resort. It reopened the swap lines, and so nobody noticed. The wheels did not come off the financial cart. There were lots of other problems. It was a pandemic, but the financial shock, okay, was probably not evident except to people who were really in the financial markets. In the global financial crisis, very different. It took years. The Fed was always asking, is it unusual in exigent circumstances yet? Can we do something? And so they intervened sort of as the wheels were falling off the cart, and so things got a lot worse. So they've learned the lesson, and the Fed is in fact operating as international lender of last resort, but really in cooperation with other central banks. Okay, so that's how the politics got worked out, really. So that the Fed is not lending to foreign banks; it's lending to foreign central banks. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and it will not lend to foreign banks. Okay, that seems okay, politically. That's okay. The U.S. is okay with that. Foreign countries are okay with that. But it is able to operate as international lender of last resort in that regard. This is, maybe another important thing to say about this is the expansion of global credit since the global financial crisis has been largely in the global south. So that's an extra challenge, and it's also the shadow banking system. It's the market-based credit system, not bank lending. So developing mechanisms to backstop that expansion of the global dollar system has been a challenge as well, and it's being tested right now. as a matter of fact, you may remember in the book I say that Charlie Kindleberger was very concerned about how are we going to work this out. The Fed is never going to want to be the international lender of last resort. Maybe we should have European membership on the FOMC, or maybe we should let the BIS become the global lender of last resort and do its operations in the Eurodollar market. He was trying to think about how to solve the political problem. Okay, that if we could maybe locate international lender of last resort in this purely technical kind of central bank, the BIS, that is not the central bank of any individual country, maybe that would depoliticize it and it would make it easier. That never came to pass. There were important swap lines run through the BIS, and now we seem to have solved the political problem, at least for the time being. So the Fed is operating in that way. Did in the COVID crisis of 2020.
What are the necessary characteristics of a global reserve currency? I think I've maybe already mentioned too, just about the dollar, that it's in global trade is invoiced in that currency, and then other countries can hold that assets denominated in that currency as a foreign exchange reserve asset. What am I missing? In other words, if we were to say, oh, the euro can't become the next global reserve currency because XYZ, or it's not XYZ and the dollar is XYZ, what are an example of those?
I think about this in key currency kind of language, that remember that the balance of payments of an individual country is settled in some international reserve. Okay, so the question is, people, the surplus countries where people want to buy your goods or buy your assets, okay, have no difficulty issuing a monetary liability, okay, because people need to make payments to you. So that's the key. Now, and I have to emphasize, it's also financial payments, because we know that the U.S. has run trade deficits for a long time. And that doesn't seem to get in the way, okay? And it's because the world wants to accumulate our assets as well, and so they're making payments to us, and that supports the value of the dollar. So some of that has to do with deep and liquid markets that are supported by a legal system and by a sophisticated banking system, largely in New York. Europe has nothing comparable to the market for treasury bills in the United States, for example. Each individual country has their own, but there's no euro bill like that.
And it's not standard. There may be a German bill, an Italian bill.
Well, exactly. It's not standard. Every treasury bill has the same signatory, and there's a full range of maturities of them too, so you can move. And so that provides a kind of deep and liquid, and it's backstopped by the Fed. Really, So the Fed is this hybrid entity that is the banker's bank, and we've been talking about the sense in which it's the banker's bank, that it is providing liquidity to the banking system, but it's also the government bank, so that it is supporting the government finances, and that means ensuring the liquidity of the treasury market. That's part of it. That's one of the reasons that it works as it does. And that's not something that really there's any competitor to at the moment. But I would, the way you frame that question, sometimes people think, oh, how could I be a reserve currency? What would I have to do? And I guess I question that premise in the beginning. It's like this has grown up organically over time. Okay, it is not that the U.S. decided to become a reserve currency, and let's put in the institutions. It more was that the dollar was chosen to be a reserve currency by market actors, and then we had to put in all of the mechanisms to support that. To support that choice by the private actors, which we did. And that's why it grows through crises, because it's not planned. It develops over time.
There have been a lot of rumblings over the past few months about de-dollarization, that Russia is going to de-dollarize. India is going to stop paying Russia in dollars. Maybe Brazil will hold yuan-denominated assets. How seriously do you take these claims? What is your own prognosis about the sustainability of the dollar standard? And can you put them in the context of folks, including academics, predicting the demise of the dollar standard, for 60 or 70 years, and it hasn't happened yet?
It's a hierarchical system, and nobody's really happy about that. And what you're hearing right now are the discontents, really in the periphery, mostly the countries that you are mentioning. In the book, I tell this story about the building of the dollar system immediately after the war. It was really all about extending the dollar system to Europe, okay, and integrating the recovering economies after World War II with the United States. And there was a lot of discontents about that. The exorbitant privilege word, was invented in France. So,
and Professor, what is that exorbitant privilege?
The complaint was that the U.S. can sort of buy things in France without ever paying for them, because it just gives you dollars, and then the French have to hold the dollars, and so they're not paying for them with real goods or with gold, as the French wanted, and not appreciating that the French banks are holding dollars because it's the world reserve currency, and so that it's useful to them. Okay, that they're not being forced to do this. It's useful to them, particularly recovering economies, and this whole thing is repeated in the last decade with the global South, right? That the global South has been accumulating lots of dollar reserve balances, even at the same time that they've been borrowing in dollar capital markets globally. That's the same thing that was happening in Europe, in the 50s. So for someone who knows history, it's like, I've seen this game before, and I see that people who are being integrated into the global dollar system find that a jarring experience, okay, and they don't like it, and that's what you're hearing. It's a business thing, okay, not a government thing. And in the way that it grows around the world, it's really quite remarkable how rapidly the global South has integrated into the global dollar system. It's largely because, before the global financial crisis, this was really the ability to tap global capital markets was really a sovereign ability. It was governments that were borrowing in global markets and then on lending to their domestic businesses. But that all changed after the global financial crisis, basically because of zero interest rate policy in the global North, and therefore search for yield by northern intermediaries, pension funds and insurance companies, who were saying, well, I guess we're going to have to find yield somewhere, and the global South was suddenly an acceptable borrower, and so away we went, and for a decade or more, that's been the story. I think that's a good thing in general for the global South and for the world, to have that expanding. Integration of these countries into the global system, but it's not a painless thing, and it has winners and losers, and and that's what we're seeing play out.
Would you say that the odds of the dollar being dethroned as a global reserve currency are, in the near term, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, low?
Well, it sort of looks that way. it's remember that Nixon, 1971. I tell this in the book. He tried to dethrone the dollar. He didn't want the dollar to be have that responsibility, and he failed. Because the world wanted the dollar. Okay, and so that was the growth of the offshore dollar system. So when the world doesn't want the dollar anymore, then we won't have the dollar anymore. Okay, but it doesn't. I don't see any any substantial move to an alternative. I don't see an alternative really that exists. That once you understand this, too, understand that being the global reserve currency comes with responsibilities. Who wants to take that responsibility? The United States didn't. Okay, and it's been sort of forced to do that. So once you understand that, you're maybe a little less eager to raise your hand. You wanted to talk about the collapse of sterling. I mean, everyone thought after World War I that we would return to the sterling standard. Certainly, the United States thought that it was just a matter of time. The sterling standard, which had existed before World War
World
One.
War One, not World War Two.
Yes, World War One. World
Right.
War One. My book, the name of it, my book is an homage to Marcello Di Cecco's wonderful history of the sterling standard. Okay, so which is up until World War One, and everyone thought that would just the war was a little interruption. It turned out that it was not just a little interruption. It was really the end of the sterling system, and that in retrospect, he tells the story, had been weakening. Some of that was also about the end of formal empire too. That it turned out that the trade surplus of India was quite important in supporting the pound sterling. The world began to look for an alternative, and the dollar seemed the eligible, and so there started to be to move in that direction. 1931, the collapse of the sterling was really the date that sterling when sterling went off gold. Just basically, there wasn't a facility for central bank cooperation to support sterling. There was all of this debt overhang from the reparations and all of that. So there were so many stresses on the system, and the Bank of England was just not able to support it all. There were attempts. I tell this story. The BIS was actually created as an attempt to commercialize the reparations agreement as a grand bargain, but it didn't get in place in time, and everything collapsed before that. And Montague Norman at the Bank of England was really key in creating that. He knew, I need some help here. I can't run this whole thing by myself. And so he was trying to get cooperation from other central banks. There was an attempt. That didn't work. And so when that didn't work, that's when sterling collapsed. Watch that. If the Fed gets into some difficulty, see what happens. Who is it getting help from other central banks, or is it not?
And what were the conditions that caused foreign holders of sterling balances to no longer want to hold them? Was it the fall in the value of those sterlings because the sterling would have to?
No,
The sterling was
no.
overvalued.
No, it was that they had all these sterling balances that they wanted to spend. They wanted to buy U.S. goods. Okay, and that meant gold outflow from the Bank of England.
Right.
And so that's what undermined the whole thing. They wanted to spend them. They wanted to spend them for dollar goods, for U.S. goods.
And the sterling was still on the gold standard. Professor, there are a lot of folks, and certainly some people watching this, who they may think that pretty much the entire world has always been on a gold standard up until 1971, at which time you had monstrous inflation and a whole series of bad things. To what degree is it true that there really was a gold standard that existed? In other words, it wasn't just a sterling standard, that the sterling was tied to gold, but every other currency was actually tied to sterling, not gold.
Yes, well, that would be my tradition. What you just said, okay? There was gold standard for sterling, okay, but really sterling was the global money, and similarly, Bretton Woods, sort of tied the dollar to gold, but not everyone else was tied to the dollar. So there was never a gold standard for it was a dollar standard. We shifted from a sterling standard before World War I to a dollar standard after World War II, and in the interim, it was just a mess
Mhm.
mostly. As you're making that transition from one to the other, it's important to emphasize this that why does it work better to have the international money, the liability of a central bank of a nation as opposed to a yellow metal or something like that? And it's because the payment system is inherently a credit thing. Okay, and so it's not money is a form of credit, the best money, because it's elastic. It's elastic outward and also inward if it's working well. So you can expand and contract both. Gold is not elastic at all. It's there's just a certain quantity of it, and you can mine more of it. It takes a while. Once it's there forever. Really, it doesn't rust. That's why we like it. But it's not a good money. It might be a good kind of standard of value. You can promise to pay gold. That's what the dollar was until 71. But once the pressure came on to actually make those payments, we went off, and the dollar system that was a shock, like 1931 was a shock. In fact, Kindleberger did worry that Nixon's abdication, as he understood it in 71, was analogous to 1931, when the sterling standard collapsed. And however, Montague Norman was forced off gold, okay, and the dollar was not in 71. This was a decision, a political decision. And so that's why Kindleberger always called it the crime of 1971. It seemed that the U.S. was abdicating its responsibility, and that there would be very bad consequences. As in fact there were. It wasn't global depression, but it was stagflation. It was inflation. You're a sort of young guy. You don't remember the 70s, but I
No, no.
do. I was in high school then, and it was not a good time to be alive. At all. It takes time to create the foreign exchange markets, the forward markets, the Eurodollar system, all of this stuff. These institutions have to grow. And in retrospect, so it took 8, 9, 10 years. I guess that's actually not long in geological time, but it's long in the life of a teenager.
Right. If I remember from your book, I think Kindleberger likened the delinking of the U.S. dollar from gold to the sterling's delinking in 1931, and as such, he expected deflation, not inflation. That he was quite surprised by inflation. Why was there inflation in the 1970s? And can you sort of link it to the unmooring of bank credit to gold? And then we'll get to Volcker's interest rate hikes. And I suppose I have a question, which is, in the absence of a gold standard, is there a need for a central bank to impose drastic price stability with far-reaching consequences on nations, on economies, on the labor force, in order to retain that exorbitant privilege? But yeah, first, how do you explain the inflation of the 1970s?
Kindleberger's explanation, which was retrospective, as I say, he thought that at first that this was a repeat of 31, so he feared deflation. But the reason we got deflation after 31 was because the international monetary system collapsed, and so there was competitive devaluation and so forth. The international monetary system was in disorder, certainly in the 70s, but it didn't collapse. This is the period when the Eurodollar system arose. Okay, and so we got price instability, but we got price on the upside, not on the downside. So it's really the flip side of the depression, and it was monetary chaos, and this is maybe relevant for understanding, even thinking about the inflation scare a little bit today. That if if Kindleberger is right, okay, people have been analogizing today to the 70s, okay? And I think it's not true. The international monetary system seems very stable today, okay? It is not at all like the 1970s, okay? So if he's right, then this is not really inflation. It's a kind of post-war price level shift, okay? And that will, because of the disordered conditions of the pandemic and also war, Ukraine war and so forth, and shifting from service economy to a goods economy and then back again, and then so there's going to be price instability, cause there's plenty of reasons for that, but that doesn't need to become ongoing inflation, I think. And I think I would bet that it won't, okay, that it's not, okay, and that we're coming to the end of it, of this period of adjustment of relative prices. But if prices are sticky downwards, the only way to adjust relative prices is for some prices to rise and the other ones to stay. And so that is rising prices. And so that is inflation. But that's not the ongoing inflation dynamic that we saw that operates through a wage price cycle or an exchange rate, devaluation and then inflation and then more devaluation. So I'm optimistic, I guess, about the longer range. But I think the next couple of years are going to be a little rocky because we are coming into the discipline phase of this system. We will be figuring out what parts of those credit expansion that we did during the zero interest rate policy were a good idea and what parts were not a good idea. And there's going to be a consolidation of that. And then 2 or 3 years from now, we will be in a position. I mean, you mentioned Volcker. So 79, this was a very painful period. And I graduated college, class of 81. So this was my time when I was, becoming an economist, really thinking about that. And that was a pretty traumatic experience. When the dollar moves against the Deutschmark and the yen, by 50%, it was a time of great instability compared to present time seemed like nothing. So probably that shapes my optimism. Is just it seems like the system is holding together at the core. Okay. That's not at all to underestimate the difficulties that are in the periphery, and the difficulties for the businesses that grew up during ZIRP. ZIRP businesses is no longer, it's no longer profitable. If you depended on ZIRP, you're not profitable anymore. And I think we are not returning to ZIRP. I think this is a pivot moment in the global dollar system. And so there are ZIRP businesses everywhere, in the world, and they're all going to be shrinking or going out of business and releasing resources for other kinds of businesses. That's what happens in a recession. So that's what's happening now. It will be difficult in particular areas where we find out, that was a ZIRP business. I didn't realize it at the time, but in fact it was. But there will be, there were good things that happened too. And I think this growth, this opening of global capital markets to the global South is, I think, permanent. Okay, it will survive the contraction that's happening now. Maybe not in every country in every way, but the general idea that we've integrated these economies into the global system, I think that will be a keeper. And also the market-based credit system, that this is the natural form of banking for a global economy, that bonds travel better than loans, and to put it sort of simply. And so that also will be consolidated. That expansion of the shadow banking system that broke in the global financial crisis was really just a U.S. thing, residential mortgage-backed securities. um, and booked offshore in Europe to a great extent. But now it's global. So it's that's been a big change in the last 10 years. Globalization of shadow banking and an extension of the dollar system to the global south.
Right. You have ZIRP, of course, is a zero interest rate policy. And I can't help but think, Professor, when the US has a zero interest rate policy, it allows Europe to have a zero interest rate policy. And Japan interest rates have been very low for a long time. But suddenly Brazil can have interest rates at 6%. But if the Federal Reserve raises to 4% in less than a year, suddenly India has to raise rates, Brazil has to raise rates. So it's always sort of follow the leader. And I'm not familiar with the figures from those times of Volcker, as you say. I'm pretty young, but I imagine when the yen devalued against the dollar, that it was because Paul Volcker raised interest rates to 16, 17, 18%, and as such, you have money flowing in to chase those high returns. What's called hot money, which you and Kindleberger write a lot about. Let's move on to sort of shadow banking and the money view. You wrote a very important piece, Zoltan Pozsar, as well as Professor Daniel Nielsen, who's been on this show,
and James Sweeney too from Credit
thank you.
Suisse. Yeah.
How do you define shadow banking, and when did it really emerge?
Well, we were trying to. We developed a definition in that paper that you're referring to. That for us, shadow bank, the essential analytical contribution was to say money market funding of capital market lending. And why is that important? Because on both sides there, you're talking about prices that are determined in dealer markets. And so looking at money market conditions and looking at capital market conditions. And I would add now, which we didn't really say in that paper, understanding that both money markets and capital markets are global markets, right? There's one capital market, not a bunch of national ones. There's one money market, not a bunch of national ones. And so that's why that form of banking kind of works. That at the time the word shadow banking was coined, many people used it to mean sort of unregulated or banking I don't like or things that should be illegal. That didn't seem useful analytically. And so things were being lumped together that were not like each other at all. Okay. And so to try to understand this phenomenon, you have to ask yourself, what is an analytical distinction? And so that's what it was. Whereas normal, when you think of a bank, you're thinking, oh, they're a deposit-taking institution that makes loans, okay? And here we're saying no, money market funding of capital market lending, no matter which balance sheet it shows up in. So it could be on a bank, and in fact, it was on the balance sheet of UBS, for example, during in the global financial crisis. It was offshore in these SIVs, these Citibank SIVs. When you see money market funding of capital market lending, you're talking about shadow banking. Whether it might also be spread across multiple balance sheets. That's what's happening with the global south now. Really, that the funding it's all offshore. It's offshore on the margin, but it's not in one institution. You could have part of the term funding here and then overnight funding over there. So it helps analytically to trace this. That's our definition of that. I haven't actually. I suppose in the book, because I'm following Kindleberger, and the shadow banking doesn't really show up much in this book, but it maybe it should. So if you look at New Lombard Street and Money and Empire together, okay, I think together they will basically. New Lombard Street is about shadow banking, okay, and Money and Empire is about the global dollar system, but they are pair. They support one another. Both of those things. You should read both of those books together.
Hey there, sorry to interrupt. A lot of Forward Guidance listeners are not into crypto. If that's you, please skip ahead, get back to the interview. Some Forward Guidance listeners are into crypto. Some own crypto, a smaller percentage owning lots of crypto. and a much smaller percentage work at crypto hedge funds. If you're in those latter two categories, Blockworks Research might be a good fit for you. Blockworks Research is a research and data platform that analyzes governance, tokenomics, and models of interesting crypto projects, including new protocols. There's a lot of edge that can be gained from reading these reports. You can check out a sample report at www.blockworksresearch.com/research and hit the free report toggle. If that is of interest, full subscriptions can be purchased at www.blockworksresearch.com/sign-up. You can also get 10% off using the discount code guidance10. Thanks, and let's get back to the interview. Right. And coming on to the money view, it strikes me that in the shadow banking world, and those specifically money market funds in 2005, 6, and 7, and 8, which owned assets that were locked up with toxic assets that maybe they were solvent, maybe they weren't, but highly illiquid asset-backed commercial paper. And if there had to be a fire sale in order to liquidate, because everyone could withdraw their liabilities at once on the liability side. On the asset side, everything can't be sold at once, and this is a crisis, a problem that banks have faced forever. Do you think that money market funds now are in a better way because they mostly own government paper, or they have accounts with the Federal Reserve at the reverse repo? Is that mostly due to regulation, or is it maybe not true?
Make the distinction between prime funds and government only funds, and I suppose an important distinction there too is the new regulation that only government funds can promise par, so that the liabilities of those funds are close substitutes for bank deposits, whereas prime not so much, and that caused a big shift of corporate funds into government only, because they are not interested in having a non-par instrument. It's not just money market mutual funds that are the funding enterprises. I mean, anyone who's holding a short-term, directly or indirectly. I mean, central banks are holding short-term dollar assets. We're wondering if the money market funds are in danger. You were talking about 2005 and 6. So yes. So what happened when the money market funds refused to roll, basically, the asset-backed commercial paper? This caused a funding crisis, for the European banks that were holding residential mortgage-backed securities. So they had to find some other way of funding this, and the money market mutual funds had to find some other asset to replace it with. And so some of that was moving things onto the balance sheet of Citibank, for example, and so Citibank issuing commercial paper, or the European banks issuing Eurodollar deposits instead of asset-backed commercial paper, or repo, or so there were initial attempts, and that didn't wind up working, and so ultimately the government got involved, and the liquidity swap lines were lending money to European central banks to lend on to these commercial banks, so that they would not liquidate their holding of mortgage-backed securities until we could sort all this out, on our side of the pond. And then we did sort it all out, and a lot of those mortgage-backed securities, wound up on the balance sheet of the Fed, or rather, they were refinanced, and it was the refinancing that liquidated the mortgage-backed securities, and then the new mortgages wound up on the balance sheet of the Fed. So that stabilized the mortgage market. So we've seen a big crisis and a lot of innovation, and to try to hold the system together in 2008 and 9. I don't think we're near anything like that today. I think we understand much more how the brave new world of shadow banking works, and also how its globalization, and an extension to the global south, how that works. I think this is probably not common knowledge, in the sense that maybe the number of people who understand how this works is maybe 10% of the population, or maybe less than that. But they're the people who need to know it. It hasn't reached the general public, I think, at all. and it hasn't really changed the way economics is taught in universities yet. There's always a lag like this. All of this stuff has happened in only 10 years, Jack. So the and academia particularly is very slow moving. It mostly is about reproducing knowledge of the past rather than creating new knowledge. So that makes it inherently conservative, and that's a good thing. I mean, that's why we have libraries. We keep all the knowledge from the past. But in times of rapid change, that means you fall behind. But the practitioners and central bankers have not fallen behind. They're paying attention to how the world works, and I think they mostly understand it. So I'm not worried that the wheels are going to fall off the cart anytime soon. Because again, a key currency view says as long as the center holds, okay, the system will hold, okay. And I think the center will hold, okay. The periphery is another matter, okay. There have been extensions of the system in directions that are in retrospect will prove ill-advised, okay. And so those things will be pruned off and consolidated, and it's not going to be pleasant. But I think the system will hold, and I'm not worried about it. You said there's this spectrum of people who hate the dollar and wish it would go away, and people who love the dollar and say it will be with us, till eternity. I'm kind of in neither group, because I'm saying this is an organic system that grows, and possibly one day there will be something that replaces it. But I will tell you that moving from the sterling system to the dollar system, I will remind you, okay, it took from 1914 to 1944. So 30 years,
And
two world wars, and a Great Depression. So be careful what you wish for. I do not wish for 30 years, two world wars, and a Great Depression. This dollar system, it's not perfect, but it seems to be holding together. Let's make it work. Let's make it work, and let's make it work for everybody. Not just the core, but the periphery too. That would be my direction here.
I want to ask you about your money view, your theory of finance, capitalism, liquidity, as well as the four prices of money, which you have written about. There is par, in other words, $10 at bank A is worth the same as a bank deposit, $10 at bank B. There is interest rates. You get 2% on this, you get 5% on this. There is exchange. There's $10, there's 10 yuan, 10 euros, and then there's the price level, aka inflation. So, what do you see as the role of the Federal Reserve? I guess on those different prices of money, and what if they come into conflict? For example, what if the only way to guarantee par and is to have a moderate amount of inflation? How do you sort of think about that trade-off?
Well, what you said about par isn't exactly right. You're saying that's about one bank account being traded for one with another bank account. The idea of par is rather that bank accounts, liabilities of the private dollar system, traded par with liabilities of the public banking system, meaning the Fed. Meaning reserves, meaning cash. Okay, so that's the par relationship there, not between banks, but between layers of the hierarchy, but between banks and central banks. And the this question of trade-off, I mean, is important. That it is in what the Bank of England did in 1931, okay, was to abandon par, right? It went par with gold, okay, and because it couldn't hold it anymore. That's at a higher level. That's the central bank against gold, not the banking system against the central bank. The United States tried to defend par, and as a consequence, our banking system collapsed in 1933, and we had Roosevelt. So I think abandoning for her central bank to abandon the gold par under pressure is the right thing to do. Okay, and then try to return to it. we don't have gold anymore. Okay, so this price level thing that you're talking about is sort of like that. In a certain way, we have during the stress of COVID, we've the central banks have abandoned par. Okay, and now they're trying to return not to the pre crisis price level, but to a new stable price level. So that would be like a new gold valuation. But it's not gold. It's the whole commodity basket. Okay, that is the par relationship there. If you think of it that way. So, and I think that's what's happening. I think that's what's happening. That we were during a crisis. You open the floodgates. You keep the system going. And then you mop up afterwards. Okay, and that's what we're doing. In that sense, it's not so much a trade-off. You're saying there's a trade-off. It's more what is the right policy for the moment. And
Mhm.
switching from elasticity to discipline. At the correct moment. The system tends. I return to this. The system tends to fluctuate. The inherent instability of credit, and so you want to just sort of put bounds on that and try to prevent it from going off the rails too far. And that's what central bankers do. And to be a lender of last resort in these times of crisis. And we will learn some lessons as we look back about the relationship between the fiscal authority and the monetary authority as well. There was a big fiscal element to that to in every country, but different countries did it differently. And so to learn from that, well, what things worked better and what things worked worse. There's going to be lots of books written about this, and we will learn from it. But we learned a lot from the global financial crisis, which is why this was not so much a monetary crisis in COVID, and the but now as I say, now we're mopping up.
Let's say if an emerging market country has a debt problem and the Federal Reserve prints a lot of money and does a lot of a swap line, that can be very effective. But it's my understanding that for price level inflation, it's the Federal Reserve's ability to control is much, much lower. What is the sort of evidence to, does interest rates at 4% as opposed to zero, how effective is that at sort of taming inflation? Of those four prices of money, the one that Jay Powell is concerned about right now the most is the price level inflation, and he does it because he says that very publicly. Do you think that is correct? And might there be a point where to fight inflation, interest rates need to go to 7%, but they simply can't for some reason? The government will pay too much on its debt, or there'll be more bank issues.
I don't know what's in Jay Powell's head. I know what he says publicly, but that's not necessarily what he actually thinks. The central bankers are in this communications business, so interest rates are a lot higher now, okay, than people are used to, for the last 10 years. And so it feels, and they've moved very rapidly. That's true too. So that's a big shock. You quite correctly point out that the link between that sort of action and the price level, is not direct. Okay. And in the money view, we understand the rate of interest as really being about the price of rolling over your debts that are coming due. So it's the survival constraint, and what higher interest rates do, higher overnight interest rates do, is to really give a big incentive for people to settle. Okay, instead of rolling over. Okay, under a zero interest rate policy, it costs you nothing to roll over. And so nobody settles. And when they don't settle, that means there's no discipline, and you never know if this business is a viable business or not a viable business. So now we're finding out. But we've only been at this a year, Jack. So it's going to take a while. Okay, we will know, 3 years from now. Okay, whether it worked or not. Is 4%, 5%? Is it enough? I doubt that we're going to have to go to 20%, like Volcker, because things had gotten way out of hand, by 1979. And I think a lot of Powell's he remembers that. You look at his gray hairs and you say, yeah, he remembers that. Okay, that we don't want to let it to get to the point where to put the wheels back on the cart takes that much. That was devastating blow for many years. It was basically 2 or 3 years of intense pain. Okay, and so I don't think that we're going to need to do that. And maybe they've done enough, maybe they haven't done enough. It does not look to me like the ZERP businesses have capitulated yet. Okay, but that just may be because they have lots of cash reserves, and those cash reserves may have come from some of the pandemic features. That there are large cash reserves around, so that businesses that are really unprofitable are running on fumes can still survive. And I don't know so much the situation in the periphery, but as you say, all these interest rates are moving together, and there will be washout in other places, and that creates then political pressure for stopping. But the system as a whole, okay, it is what I think I'm watching. Because if the system as a whole, or if the core of the system breaks, then we have global financial crisis. Okay, but I don't see that. So I think that most of the stresses are manageable, will be manageable in the next year or two.
Hey there, sorry to interrupt. Announcement. Blockworks is hosting an event called Permissionless in September. It's a crypto event. It's in Austin, Texas. We did Permissionless in 2022. It was the biggest and best DeFi event in the world. And this year, Lightning will be striking twice. Historically, our ticket prices have gone up about 10 times from the day the tickets go live to the day before the event. If you're like me and bad at math, that's 900%. So it might be savvy for attendees to consider buying tickets now rather than later. If you're listening to this and you're saying, hey, Jack, I'm not really into this whole crypto thing. I want to hear about the Fed. I want to hear about the dollar, Bretton Woods 3, 4, 5. I hear you. I'm not telling you to buy a ticket, and the interview will resume momentarily. However, if you are into the crypto thing and Permissionless is something you might want to attend, what I'm saying is there's no time like the present, because tickets will go up, and if history is any guide, prices will go up a ton. Anyway, the link is in the description, and you can get an additional 10% off by using code GUIDANCE10. Thanks. Let's get back to the interview. Professor, there is a phrase that I've encountered before, an idea called Triffin's dilemma, and it sounds very intelligent and sophisticated. Reading your book, you and in particular Kindleberger had a somewhat critical view of Triffin's dilemma, and given that I just read your book, so I'm seeing it through through your eyes and I guess Kindleberger's eyes. It does make sense. A theory that hasn't really worked out for 70 years, maybe should be a little bit challenged. What is the Triffin dilemma, the dollar glut, and how did it differ from Kindleberger's version of the dollar shortage? And the track record of the past 70 years, sort of who's won that argument?
Well, I tell this story in chapter 6. So Triffin was a professor at Yale, and he wrote a book called Gold and the Dollar Crisis that captured the imagination of President Kennedy, and therefore the economics profession that was advising President Kennedy. I think that's sort of where it came from. Triffin was basically a complete contemporary of Kindleberger. Although he was a Belgian by birth, and I mentioned that because that may be part of his sense that he didn't like the dollar system. He thought that it was that he thought somehow that at Bretton Woods the IMF had been set up to be a sort of transnational global central bank, and that somehow the U.S. went back on its treaty obligations. And so so this is his attempt to make that argument. He says that in order for a national currency to be an international currency, the U.S. would have to run trade deficits. Okay, and in order to get those dollars, so it has to pay for goods with dollars, not with goods. Okay, if the rest of the world needs to accumulate dollars, this is a dilemma because by running a trade deficit, the US is actually becoming a weaker economy. And so eventually there's going to be a run on the dollar. And so the dollar becomes weak. He pointed out that his big famous graph in that book, okay, was showing the European accumulation of dollar balances in the United States, okay, against the US holdings of gold. Okay. And the European accumulation was going up and up and up, and the US dollar holdings was going down and down and down. And they crossed. Okay. Those two lines crossed. And so he was pointing out that there isn't enough gold in Fort Knox if there's a run on the dollar. So this is the moment in which the dollar is now, we need to find an alternative. And so Kindleberger basically disagreed with almost all of that. That certainly you do not need to run a trade deficit in order to supply the rest of the world with liquid balances, because you could just do a swap of IOUs with them. And in fact, the New York was, right. We were lending to Europe in dollars long term by buying bonds, okay, and they were lending to us buying, having deposit accounts. And so you can increase the global holding of dollar deposit accounts simply by lending them money, not by selling them goods. And that's what was happening. That the U.S. He would always say that the U.S. is a financial intermediary. It's the bank of the world. Okay, it's expanding its balance sheet on both sides, so that it's not true that the United States, that there's some dilemma that prevents a national currency from being a global currency. And in fact, that's what Britain did when sterling was. So this is the lesson from history. It's also not true that somehow when this dollar line crosses the gold line, there, banking is not. It's not that the dollars are somehow in the place of the gold. Fractional reserve banking is the nature of the game, and it's not the dollar. The dollar holdings of the rest of the world are increasing because the rest of the world is growing and they need more dollar reserves. And so they will be increasing every year, and that's not right to think of that as a deficit. That's selling liquidity services to the rest of the world. So this was Kindleberger's view. And the fundamental difference between Triffin and Kindleberger is that, and in fact, between the economics profession and Kindleberger, is that the economics profession is generally thinking about economic policy as a national thing. They're trying to think about advising governments about monetary policy and fiscal policy and so forth. And Kindleberger is always thinking globally. Okay, he's thinking about the dollar system, not about what's best for the United States, okay, but about the dollar system. And so making the dollar system work, okay, was what he was trying to do in 1966. Instead of trying to kill it, the U.S. government kept being worried, so they drove a lot of this business out of New York, offshore, back to London, which London was perfectly happy to have because they knew how to do global banking. They had done it for a long time, so that the knowledge of how to do global banking was there. And so the Eurodollar system grew up because the U.S. rejected having New York as the new London. So that's how the dollar system expanded, frankly, by the U.S. refusing. So the Triffin dilemma, I don't know. There's a lot of things like this that students are really fascinated by, and they like it. And so, things like the money multiplier too. We still teach it. This is that are not actually very helpful for understanding how money works. And once they're in the textbooks, it's very hard to get them out of the textbooks. So that's a problem. It's my problem. I teach money banking. So that's the nature of the beast, and I can't fight that. So I would just say that the fact that the majority of economists adopt one way of thinking doesn't mean that they're right. Okay, it may well be that the minority view is actually right. Okay, and is worth considering as a possibility. We don't decide truth by votes. Okay, And so that's what was one of my goals in this book a little bit is to provide enough context for how Kindleberger thought about the world so that you could really appreciate what his alternative view was. I think he was not understood largely because he didn't write in math and statistics and so forth. And so it seemed like he was an old-fashioned economist who really didn't understand modern economics or something. Well, it's not really, I think that's not really right. Okay. He had another way of doing economics that led him to see different things in the world, which happened in retrospect to be prescient and correct. But he was a Cassandra, so he was not listened to really in his own time. Maybe now is his time. Maybe people will look back and say, that guy had more. I've been giving talks like that I gave one to economic historians at Rutgers just last week, and they were saying, I knew him, and I never understood what but he seems like maybe he was actually right. Now that I think back on, so part of me is translating for a modern audience, so that people can understand, and then they can decide what they want to do with their teaching of Triffin dilemma in their classes. And similarly, flexible exchange rates. That chapter 7 is about that, about Harry Johnson. And a lot of the economists thought, we should just abandon fixed exchange rates. We should let prices fluctuate, just as we let price of potatoes fluctuate. We should let price of currencies. And Charlie was against that because he thinks, this is we don't want to have every state having its own currency and then fluctuating against each other. There's an advantage to having the dollar system in the United States, having it unified. Okay. His teacher at Columbia was part of creating the Fed. And so he saw that, and he just played that same logic, works globally too, that a global trading system requires a global currency. And or fixed exchange rates are sort of like that, that's sort of a global currency. We don't have fixed exchange rates now, but we have foreign exchange swaps and so forth that are holding all the currencies together. Not one for one; it's not fixed, but they limit the fluctuations. That proved to be the solution, at least for now, the institutional solution.
Right. And so fixed exchange rates, he was an advocate of that, of staying on it longer than the world did. I never really understood how that worked. What was the mechanism of adjusting the balance of payments? And I think a lot of that was agreed upon at Bretton Woods. Sort of a lot of people in macroeconomics and the academic profession pay a lot of attention to Bretton Woods and sort of worship it to some degree in the book. And I don't know if it was you calling it this, you the author, or Kindleberger calling this, or for someone else. The Bretton Woods is having a certain mythic quality. What was the mythical nature of Bretton Woods?
Oh, the mythical quality was the notion that somehow Bretton Woods created the global dollar system as an act of benign multilateralism. Okay, that's the myth. Okay, the truth. Okay, the empirical truth is that the global dollar system grew organically and was being blessed at Bretton Woods, was being politically blessed. Multilaterally, so that U.S. would be the leader and everyone else would be the followers, and everyone was going to be okay with that. Now, you got to remember that this was also not clear that this exercise was happening, while the war was still going on. So it was so Kindleberger was not there, couldn't have been there. He was fighting the war in Europe. So the importance of Bretton Woods it has this political importance, that we are now going to continue to work together in peace, economic cooperation after we win the war. Okay, that's what they are agreeing at Bretton Woods. And all of that then gets reified in the textbooks, like, that's when we created the post-war system and so forth. Remember that Bretton Woods allowed there to be exchange rate movements for fundamental imbalance. Okay, so leave that aside. You asked how do fixed exchange rates work? They work essentially through interbank borrowing or between countries, global borrowing, to absorb temporary deficits and surpluses. So the global banking system is the key backstop for a stable exchange rate system in this sense, that countries that are running deficits can borrow from countries that are running surpluses, but it's not the sovereigns that are borrowing and lending; it's their banking systems. So that it operates as a business thing, okay, not as a government thing.
Implicit in that is or is not the assumption that it's a temporary thing. Oh, I
Yes,
spent
sure,
more than I earned, so
sure.
I'll get it back. Whereas now
Yes.
the U.S. has
Yeah,
had a
that's why I
structural.
said fundamental imbalance. Okay, with if in fact if you're running fundamental imbalance, then the exchange rate is wrong, and that can be because the different inflation rates in the different countries or so forth. So I'm just saying that in the logic of clearing, okay, is that deficit agents temporarily borrow from surplus agents, and then later on it'll go the other way. Okay, and a very important thing for Kindleberger was there are some countries who should be running deficits all the time. So developing countries that are borrowing for capital development or something like that. We don't want to think about that as a deficit that needs to be solved with short term bank flows, because they're not going to pay it back. In the short run, they can't pay it. It's not for that. It's for capital development. So that should be funded by access to global capital markets. So 10-year bonds, 20-year bonds. That's what Kindleberger would be so thrilled, okay, that the last 10 years have meant access to global capital markets by the global South. That's what he wanted to happen 50 years before. Okay, it just took a long time. It was always, for him and his friends, the key institution at Bretton Woods was not the IMF. The key institution was the World Bank, okay, because it was lending for development. And the BIS already existed. So the BIS, which was dealing with interbank balances, central bank balances. So the BIS stabilized the European currencies. They weren't convertible until 1958, but the way it stabilized them was precisely by moving money from the deficits to the surpluses on the balance sheet of the BIS, and acting as a kind of central bank for the central banks of the different European countries. So it's interesting that you should ask however would a fixed exchange rate system work, because your experience has been entirely in your life with flexible exchange rates.
The book is Money and Empire, Charles Kindleberger and the Dollar System. I read the book. It was fantastic. So to all the listeners reading out, you definitely want to check this out. A great mix of some biographical information as well as the ideas, which we've been talking primarily. My final question for you, Professor, is what would you say the reason that you wrote this book, Kindleberger's intellectual achievements that you think are not covered within his legacy? What do you feel like about Kindleberger's legacy is missing?
Okay. So I've given talks all about this. He is a representative of this key currency tradition of thinking of international monetary system that was also John H. Williams and others.
A different John H. Williams than the one who currently is chairman of the New York Fed.
Yes. He was vice president at the New York Fed when Charlie was in graduate school in 1931. So, and when Charlie went to work there too in 1937. So it's a tradition of. It is kind of the money view that we've been talking about, which I developed for sort of the United States and dollar money markets, extended to the international scheme. So that's the main idea. Okay, is that this key currency view, which has been a minority view basically forever, is worth thinking about. Okay, that it gets some things right about the forces that are driving the long-term development of the global international monetary system, and is therefore, I think, worth having in an economist toolbox. That a theory that is prescient, it sees the future. Okay, as I say, Charlie saw we need to get capital markets extended to the global south. Well, it took 50 years. It's prescient. And in retrospect, correct that in fact, all of these crises, when the dollar was counted out, or the attempt of Nixon to kill the dollar system, the attempts of others to create substitutes for it, the dollar system just takes those blows and then it consolidates and it comes back. So in retrospect, it seems that this way of thinking about international money has a lot going for it, and should be more widely discussed and considered. And I think it's largely unknown. World of Depression is his first sort of big history book, okay? And Manias, Panics, and Crashes, that's coming out in its 8th edition right now, with a new co-author, Bob Macaulay, who was a student of Kindleberger's, as a matter of fact. So so that's another, and then his great treatises, the International Money Essays and the Financial History of Western Europe. So that was the beginning of his third career, writing that book. And a lot of his thinking, once he was out of academia, he was forced to retire in 1976. He had complete freedom. And so he took advantage of that freedom and wrote much more easily and freely in his later life. But people don't understand those things because they don't understand what came before. And I'm hoping that my book will provide an easy entry point. It's not a long book. Okay,
it's not. It's amazing how much you managed to pack in there for how long it is.
It's a pretty dense book. Okay,
yeah.
But it's a pretty dense book. But it's a story too. So I always tell my students, just read it. You don't have to. It has a certain narrative arc to it. You can read this at different levels. You can read it quickly as a biography. Okay, you can read it very slowly as a critique of modern economics. Okay, or you can read it at a middle level that it's kind of an alternative view of what happened in the international monetary system over his lifetime. And it's an alternative to what you will have learned in your classes, which puts Bretton Woods at the center, right, and doesn't mention anything about the tripartite agreement in 1936. So it's a different set of pivotal dates, and so it is a revisionist history of international money, as well as a biography, as well as an excavation of an alternative monetary theory. Those are all three things in that 200 some pages. So, but you can read it in any of those three ways. They're intertwined.
Yes, they are. Well, Professor, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and insights. It was fascinating to learn from your book and to learn from you speaking just now. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and please check out the book. You won't be disappointed. Thanks, and talk soon. Forward Guidance, the program you just enjoyed, hopefully, can be viewed on YouTube at Blockworks Macro or heard as a podcast on Apple Podcast and Spotify. Episodes are typically released on Apple and Spotify a few hours before they air on YouTube. Please leave a review on Apple Podcast if you feel so inclined. Also, you can get 10% off to Permissionless 2023 and Blockworks Research using code GUIDANCE10. Thanks again, and be well.